Hello guys, welcome back to our anime moments. Guys, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Today is explanation of upcoming episode of Soul Land 2 Part 125 based on novel. So let's start. Hui Yuhao didn't know what Tang Wutong was thinking inside. He nodded at her with a faint smile on his face when she didn't answer him, and then turned around and walked towards the canteen. Tang Wutong shook her fist furiously as she watched Hui Yuhao's figure gradually disappear. She really wanted to beat this detestable guy up, even though she didn't know why this guy was so detestable. I also want to eat. Tang Wutong stomped her foot, and raised her little arrogant chin pridefully as she stepped towards the canteen. After breakfast, everything around Hui Yuhao seemed to become air. He directly returned to his tent, and didn't reappear until evening. He didn't even come out for lunch. Others naturally wouldn't go disturb him. Soul Masters sometimes skipped meals when they were having closed-door cultivation. That was very normal. Hui Yuhao only reappeared once the sky had gone completely dark. This time, he went right into the commander's tent. "Duke, sir." Hui Yuhao greeted respectfully as he came before the White Tiger Duke. "I heard you didn't eat lunch, Yuhao. Were you cultivating?" The White Tiger Duke asked with a faint smile on his face. He had a very good impression of Hui Yuhao. This youth wasn't even 20, but he had a very calm and stable personality. More importantly, he had that spiritual detection, and he could be said to be a fantastic boost for the Star Luo Empire's reconnaissance efforts and capability. Even though they were mired in a terrible situation at the moment, they were at least able to find some chances to resist their enemies on the level of Soul Masters. Hui Yuhao said, "Sir, I have to go out tonight. I'm here to report my intentions to you." "What?" The smile on the White Tiger Duke's face immediately froze. "You going back out tonight?" "No." Dai Hao almost immediately denied Hui Yuhao's words. "What kind of joke is that? Last night's expedition was already so dangerous, and he almost didn't come back. What are we to do if the Death God is activated when he heads back out tonight?" Without considering how he felt about him, and just considering his reconnaissance value and his importance to the entire Star Luo Empire, his death in action would be an enormous and irreparable loss. Hui Yuhao smiled and said, "Rest assured, Duke. I will not risk my life to investigate the Death God. I have to think about this a little more because I haven't done sufficient preparation. However, I can't do nothing right now, otherwise we're as good as trapped right here, and the Sun Moon Empire would have achieved their goal in this aspect." "Then what are you going to do?" The White Tiger Duke's expression relaxed a little. Hui Yuhao squinted a little and said, "The Sun Moon Empire have locked down our surveillance capabilities for such a long time. I don't have a solution for the main peak where the Death God is located, but can I not do something about those surveillance soul tools? I'm going to cause some trouble for them." The White Tiger Duke's eyes glowed. "Are you saying?" Hui Yuhao stepped in front of the White Tiger Duke and whispered some things to him. The White Tiger Duke's eyes became increasingly bright as he listened, and he nodded continuously towards the end. "All right, do that. Don't worry, everything that you achieve or obtain will belong to you. Of course, if you're willing, the Empire is willing to pay and purchase them from you as well. What do you think?" "Deal." Hui Yuhao answered without hesitation. The White Tiger Duke asked, "Do you need me to help with anything?" Hui Yuhao shook his head and said, "No need. I'll be the smallest target by myself, so my buddies from the Tang sect will be enough to give me support. One reason why I came to tell you is so that you will know, and another reason is so that I can tell you to pay attention to your defenses and to safeguard against any operations that our enemies may take in revenge." A sneer appeared at the corner of the White Tiger Duke's mouth. "Revenge? I was afraid that they wouldn't come. I earnestly wish that they send their entire army to take their revenge. The Star Luo Empire had an absolute advantage in terms of open battle. They had 8 Soul Master Legions worth of fighting strength, and without considering soul tools, the White Tiger Duke was confident of completely defeating the Soul Engineers in the Sun Moon Empire's hand that protects the nation if they were fighting one-on-one. Of course, the premise was that the Soul Engineers appeared as Soul Masters. Hui Yuhao immediately gathered his companions once he exited the commander's tent and told them about his plan. No one was overly worried about his plans. With Hui Yuhao's abilities, he wouldn't be in too much danger as long as he didn't investigate the main peak. In the end, his abilities to confuse his enemies were too strong. 1 hour later, the camp that belonged to the Star Luo Empire's northwestern field army was completely pitch black. There was light shining from the surveillance towers, but besides that, the soldiers were all resting. Such was life in the military. Everyone slept early and woke up early. They did this to avoid ambushes from their enemies at midnight, and so that the army could keep themselves in top fighting condition. A black shadow rose soundlessly through the air and high into the sky in the darkness of the night. All of the Northwestern Field Army's aerial surveillance soul tools were entirely shut down at this moment, and this shadow didn't trigger any reaction at all as it rose into the sky. Shadow after shadow rose into the sky immediately afterwards, and they followed that first figure. Hui Yuhao was flying at an altitude of about 1,000 meters. His flying-type soul tool was activated, and he was using imitation at the same time. It was easiest for him to control his flight at such a height, and his speed was incredible. Typical surveillance soul tools in the air couldn't even detect his existence. The Mingdo mountain range was but several dozen kilometers from the Northwestern Field Army's camp. Soul sages required very little time to fly across such a short distance. The dark towering mountain swiftly appeared within Hui Yuhao's vision. At this moment, he was completely within the range of the Sun Moon Empire's aerial surveillance soul tools. Hui Yuhao stabilized himself in midair and looked up at the sky. He ran the risk of being detected if he continued forward. The oscillation detectors were the most troublesome for him. Those soul tools released countless sound waves, and their method of detection imitated that of bats. Any kind of soul skills meant for concealment wouldn't avoid detection. Oscillation detectors were undoubtedly the mainstream for future development in surveillance soul tools. At this point, their detection range was just relatively shorter. Hui Yuhao released his spiritual power and stretched it far into the distance. Hui Yuhao's eyes quickly revealed surprised, "Damn! How many surveillance soul tools are there?" Not far in the distance, there were thousands of surveillance soul tools of many different kinds dotting the sky. There were surveillance soul tools of almost every type, and they were arranged neatly in midair as they stretched out to both sides of the mountain range. They stretched beyond the horizon with no end in sight, and just looking at them in front of him made him feel like there were thousands of them. It was hard to say how many more there were further out. "That's nice, the Sun Moon Empire is very wealthy." A faint smile appeared on Hui Yuhao's face as his flying-type soul tool slowly became vertical. The blast ports pointed downwards, and he released his own soul power at the same time. His entire body surged into the sky, and he flew towards a higher altitude. The aerial surveillance soul tools in front of him weren't his targets. There were large amounts of ground-to-air and air-to-ground offensive soul tools behind those surveillance soul tools cooperating with them. That was position after position of soul tools. Individually, their offensive capabilities paled in comparison with that of the Death God, but if all their offensive capabilities fired off at the same time, they would be able to cover an incredibly massive area. Escaping from them wouldn't be that easy. Otherwise, what did they rely on to stop the Star Luo Empire's great army? The sky became increasingly cold, and everything on the ground became increasingly small. Hui Yuhao took about 15 minutes to fly from 1,000 meters all the way to around 3,000 meters in the air. He began to expend his soul power swiftly once he reached this height. A target came within range of Hui Yuhao's spiritual detection not far in the distance. Hui Yuhao immediately activated imitation to the highest possible level, and he channeled his soul power and suddenly picked up speed as he flew towards the large item that was over 2 meters long. High-altitude aerial surveillance soul tools. Only these types of soul tools could hover at 3,000 meters. The power that the aerial surveillance soul tools 1,000 meters in the sky used mostly came from milk bottles, and they flew very quickly when special attachments were added to them. However, high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tools had to resist the bitter cold, and there were multiple other requirements that they had to deal with to remain at such an altitude, so they seemed a lot more unwieldy and heavy. Hui Yuhao had captured one before, so he understood their structure very well. High-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tools relied more on visual detection. Oscillation capabilities hadn't been developed yet, and thermal detection wasn't very useful, so they weren't installed. Hua Yuhao relied on his imitation, and in addition to his aura of ultimate ice concealing him, it was impossible for him to be discovered as he moved closer. He quickly arrived above this high-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tool. He wasn't hasty about it, and he activated spiritual detection and surveyed his surroundings. The same model's altitudes in the sky wouldn't vary that much, and searching for high-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tools at such a height was naturally the easiest. About 3 minutes later, the corner of Hua Yuhao's mouth curled into a satisfied smile. He suddenly descended a little, and placed a metal piece that was about the size of a palm against the top of that high-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tool. This metal piece didn't have a large surface area, and it was stuck against the SOL tool's blind spot, so Hua Yuhao wasn't afraid of it being discovered at all. He flew back up again afterwards and went towards his next target. There were 6 milk bottles attached to the flying-type SOL tool behind him. These 6 milk bottles could double the amount of time that Hua Yuhao could continue flying at a height of 3,000 meters. But even then, he had to continuously consume his own soul power at the same time, and he also had to fight against the thin air and the bitter cold, so his soul power and physical strength were still being continuously expended. Hua Yuhao finally began to feel a little fatigued roughly 1 hour later. He turned around and flew back in the direction he had come from. Hua Yuhao dropped back to the ground only after he flew out of the detection range of the Sun-Moon Empire's surveillance SOL tools. "How's it?" Xu Sanxia had been waiting here for a long time, in accordance with the arrangements of Hua Yuhao's spiritual detection. Hua Yuhao was evidently a little excited. He chuckled and said, "It's done, third senior brother. Just wait and see, this time, the Sun-Moon Empire will definitely feel the pain in their bones." Xu Sanxia laughed and said, "I like that. Don't worry, everyone's in position. Go and take a rest." "Yes." Hua Yuhao retrieved 2 milk bottles and crossed his legs as he sat down. He absorbed the soul power within those milk bottles as he activated his mysterious heaven technique at the same time so that he could replenish what he had expended from before. Wang Dong's figure suddenly appeared in his mind in that instant. How fantastic would it have been if Dong was here? With Dong around, we could use the Haodong power together, and that would help me recover a lot faster than using these milk bottles. Hua Yuhao's heart began to throb painfully when he thought about Wang Dong, and his excitement from before dropped a little. However, Hua Yuhao was a high-level soul master, and he was very aware of the effect inner demons had on cultivation. He quickly dispelled his thoughts and returned to calmness. Hua Yuhao's recovery abilities were very formidable. He leveraged his tremendous life energy and recovered most of his physical strength and spiritual power after a few moments. Hua Yuhao opened his eyes, and 2 cold lightning streaks seemed to flash across the night sky. Hua Yuhao nodded at Xu Sanxia, who was protecting him beside him, and said, "All right, that's good enough. I'm going, third senior brother." "All right. I'll back you up. Let's go." Xu Sanxia chuckled, and he surged into the air with Hua Yuhao at the same time. However, Hua Yuhao was flying towards the Sun-Moon Empire while Xu Sanxia went straight up into the sky. Hua Yuhao was back in the air, and he flew to about 1,000 meters high. He returned to the edge of the Sun-Moon Empire's aerial surveillance SOL tools before he stopped, and retrieved a strange-looking SOL tool from his pocket. This SOL tool looked like a metal box. It wasn't very big, and it was about half a meter long, 30 centimeters wide, and 20 centimeters thick. This metal box's structure seemed a little crude, but one could tell upon closer inspection that the crudeness and roughness was actually caused by uncountable fine patterns aggregated together. There were many demonic patterns etched into the box. Hua Yuhao made several quick presses on its surface, and faint soul power undulated from the box. In the next moment, a single metal line protruded from its front and quickly stretched out to almost 2 meters long. The metal line's tip suddenly opened, and transformed into circle after circle of metal threads. The whole thing looked extremely strange. Hua Yuhao infused his soul power into the box, and swiftly pressed a few more lines. The protruding metal threads glowed with circles of silver light as formless waves rippled outwards discreetly. "Teacher Xian, I hope your toy works. Hu Hao muttered to himself amusedly. High up in the sky over the horizon, there was a high-altitude aerial surveillance tool that had many auxiliary attachments open to help it hover in midair. The metal piece that was about the size of a palm at its tip suddenly lit up as whirlpool-like circles of light quickly appeared on top of it. That light was very strange, and gentle undulations emanated from its surface. The light suddenly became stronger and lit up the area above this high-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tool. Bam! A crisp sound could be heard, and wave after wave of electricity was released from that metal piece, which quickly surged inside the high-altitude surveillance SOL tool. The high-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tool was originally operating stably, but it suddenly began to tremble violently as the light on top of it became even more intense. The same situation happened to every single high-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tool within hundreds of kilometers around. It seemed as if they were all malfunctioning. Inside the Sun-Moon Empire's camp on the Mingdo mountain range. What? The high-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tools are malfunctioning. We've lost communication. They were camped in a depression within the mountain, and they even bored a cave into the mountain for safety purposes. They were located not far behind the Mingdo mountain range's tallest peak, and they were specifically responsible for controlling all the surveillance SOL tools in the area. This place could be called the Sun-Moon Empire's intelligence headquarters in the Mingdo mountain range, and a Class 9 SOL engineer was personally in charge of it. This Class 9 SOL engineer was the Mad Bull de Law, Wang Yiheng, who was also the commander of the evil tyrant SOL Engineer Legion. He was deployed here impromptu. The evil tyrant Legion had switched guard duties with the Legion that was originally stationed here for one simple reason: the evil tyrant Legion's SOL engineers were the quickest, and they were the most skilled and adept at reacting to all kinds of situations. Wang Yiheng's face turned black as he listened to that SOL engineer's report. Just several minutes ago, across several dozens of kilometers of the sky in front of the Mingdo mountain range's main peak, they lost contact with more than 20 high-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tools. This situation was unprecedented. If they lost contact with a single high-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tool, one could still say that the SOL tool had malfunctioned by itself. However, losing contact with so many at the same time, what did that mean? Somebody had done something to them. Even Title Dolor had trouble unleashing their abilities at an altitude of 3,000 meters. There might be reason to believe that someone had incapacitated a single high-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tool without being discovered, but incapacitating tens of those things at once. Could it be that tens of Title Dolor who were adept at concealing themselves had made a move at the same time? How was that possible? Not even the entire continent had so many Title Dolor who were good at concealing their tracks. Has the Patrol Legion been activated? They have been deployed, sir. I'm afraid they won't have enough manpower. Pass down my order: deploy the evil tyrant Legion's dagger section, and they have to do everything they can to capture their enemies should they run into any. If they discover our high-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tools, they have to snatch them back. If we really can't take them back, we can't let them end up in the hands of the Star Luo Empire even if they are broken. Yes. Orders quickly came out from the intelligence headquarters. Wang Yiheng paced up and down inside his cave, and his expression was as black as could be. His back was drenched with sweat after pacing a few rounds. The Sun-Moon Empire's high-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tools were immature, but they still represented the Sun-Moon Empire's highest standard of surveillance SOL tools. If the Star Luo Empire managed to obtain and decipher those things, then he would have committed an unforgivable sin. No, I have to go. Wang Yiheng continued contemplating, but he wasn't assured enough, and immediately rushed out of the cave. He activated his Class 9 flying-type SOL tool and rose into the sky like a beam of light. He activated his communication SOL tools at the same time so that he could receive intelligence from their intelligence arm in real time. It was no wonder that Wang Yiheng couldn't figure out what was going on. The Sun-Moon Empire had been very good at locking down the Star Luo Empire's surveillance capabilities over this period of time, and the Star Luo Empire had been suppressed to the point where they couldn't resist at all. High-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tools were more than 3,000 meters in the sky. They were about 2 meters in diameter, and seemed quite bulky. But that size was barely anything in the boundless horizons of the sky, and it wasn't even as large as a dust particle when viewed from afar. Looking for one was already difficult, let alone finding more than 20 across several hundred kilometers of the sky. What was more frightening was that his enemies could mess things up at the same time. That was just an unimaginable situation. The Sun-Moon Empire had only made a little more than 100 such high-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tools, and this was the product of their latest research discoveries. They still needed to continue refining them afterwards, but all that refinement had to be based on the original foundations. Loss of even a single one was a terrible loss. Without discussing other things, the materials used to craft these SOL tools so that they could continuously operate at high altitudes meant these were top-grade materials used for crafting SOL tools. They had just lost more than 20 at once. Wouldn't the Sun-Moon Empire's Emperor Xu Tianran go insane? Hu Yuhao was still hovering in midair, and the smile on his face became increasingly radiant. A small screen appeared on the metal box of his, and its display clearly showed that more than 20 green dots of light were flying in his direction. Furthermore, they were moving at an altitude of 3,000 meters. Very nice. Not even the Sun-Moon Empire can possibly discover that I've stolen those things. Let me capture them. Hu Yuhao quickly surged into the sky, and began to fly towards an altitude of 3,000 meters. At this point, those high-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tools were flying towards him at speeds as fast as they could reach. The Sun-Moon Empire's aerial surveillance SOL tools were completely useless at 3,000 meters, and his location wasn't close to the Mingdo mountain range. How could he be detected at that altitude? The metal pieces and the metal box with a metal thread that was more than 2 meters long were all newly developed creations by the master of the Tang sect SOL tool hall, Xianziwen. Furthermore, Xianziwen had custom-made those items for Hu Yuhao after he had brought that super-high aerial surveillance SOL tool back the other time. This was a Class 8 SOL tool, and it was the best possible one that Xianziwen could make. It was known as a long-range SOL controller. Xianziwen had initially crafted this SOL tool to remotely control his own aerial surveillance SOL tools from a distance. The Sun-Moon Empire was already very familiar with this technology, but Xianziwen made the effects of their long-range SOL controllers even better, so that they could be used at even greater distances for remote control purposes. The Sun-Moon Empire's aerial surveillance SOL tools were controlled using similar mechanisms and attachments, but their receiving ends were installed inside them, while the metal piece that Hu Yuhao had used previously was installed on the outside. Xianziwen had made this thing after having an epiphany. He had quickly found loopholes in the high-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tool after giving it a simple inspection. This was one of the illustrious Virtue Hall's most important research directions back when he was still there, and thus he knew a lot about them due to his position as their chief researcher. Therefore, he gave the long-range SOL controller that he had created to Hu Yuhao after refining it. He added some unique and special formation arrays meant for controlling purposes on the metal piece. These formation arrays could generate intense jolts of energy that destroyed the control units within the SOL tool, and the metal piece would hack into the SOL tool at the same time and gain control over the entire control system of the high-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tools. They could then be remotely controlled by the metal box in Hu Yuhao's hands from a long distance away. There were many complicated theories involved, and even Hu Yuhao wasn't very adept in this respect even though he was a Class 7 SOL engineer. Of course, his long-range SOL controller could only control high-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tools after he had refined it. His SOL tool couldn't control other kinds of SOL tools. At this moment, Hu Yuhao used that feature to kidnap a bunch of high-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tools. Just like what Wang Yiheng was worried about, the research conducted by the Doluo continent's 3 original nations towards surveillance SOL tools would be greatly boosted if so many high-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tools fell into Hu Yuhao's hands. Hu Yuhao could already see high-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tools flying towards him one after another in the distance. However, he could also see beams of light flying out from the Mingdo mountain range one after another at the same time, and they were heading right toward this side. Hu Yuhao had already predicted this a long time ago. The Sun-Moon Empire had just lost contact with so many high-altitude aerial surveillance SOL tools at the same time. Things would really be strange if they didn't react. I hope the title Doluo or a Class 9 SOL engineer doesn't appear first from the enemy's party. Hui Yuhao glanced at the metal box in his hands, and he squinted a little as he activated spiritual detection to its highest possible level. There were self-destructive mechanisms installed in his long-range soul controllers, so he could still destroy those high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tools if he couldn't take them away. However, that was a last resort. His heart would ache if he had to destroy so many precious things. The value of just the rare metals involved in crafting them was already unimaginable. The first high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tool quickly flew before Hui Yuhao. He swiftly went up, and the light on his starlight sapphire storage ring flashed once before it swallowed the entire thing. First one. Because every single high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tool varied in distance from each other, their arrivals were bound to be staggered even if they started flying towards Hui Yuhao at the same time. Second one. Third one. It didn't take long before Hui Yuhao had pocketed 6 high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tools in his starlight sapphire storage ring. Seems like I'll return with uncountable rewards and gains. However, 5 shadows swiftly bore down on him at this moment. These 5 shadows didn't come together, but were separated in the sky. Hui Yuhao had activated imitation and his spiritual interference domain, and it was very hard to discover his presence. Hui Yuhao had already seen them coming a long time ago with spiritual detection. Every single one of these 5 soul engineers carried detectors in their hands, and these detectors were the most advanced oscillation detectors, things that Hui Yuhao wasn't immune to. Even though they didn't know Hui Yuhao's particular location, they could cover a large area of effect if they stretched their detectors in all directions. They would discover Hui Yuhao as long as they figured out his rough location. These people were currently coming closer to Hui Yuhao's position. Hui Yuhao swept his mind towards the sky in the distance with spiritual detection, and the other high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tools that were still gathering rapidly. The safest decision for Hui Yuhao would be to turn tail and run, before destroying the ones that he couldn't keep. He would deal severe losses to his opponents and would also return with a decent harvest. But he couldn't resign himself to making that decision. He could only use this method once, his enemies wouldn't be tricked the next time. Even one extra soul tool stolen was another giant pot of wealth gained. Hui Yuhao contemplated for a moment before he decisively withdrew the metal box in his hands, and then turned around and went straight for lower altitudes. The high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tools that were hurrying over would gather at this location. Hui Yuhao was certain that he didn't have enough time to gather them all, so he took the initiative to reveal himself so that he could attract his enemy's attention, so that he could preoccupy them. Perhaps he could even defeat them in battle, so that he could buy time for those super-high surveillance soul tools to fly over before taking everything away after that. That would undoubtedly be the best outcome. Before he executed this operation, Hui Yuhao had considered asking the White Tiger Duke to deploy Soul Masters to help him. However, normal Soul Masters couldn't even come near this region without being discovered by the aerial surveillance soul tools, so only he could conceal himself while maintaining himself at such a height. I'll take this chance. If it doesn't work, then I'll run. Hui Yuhao had become a lot more courageous after the Skydream Iceworm had reminded him of the benefits that the Beast God's reverse scale could bring him. Hui Yuhao plunged downwards quickly, and immediately changed directions towards the side after he dropped to about 2,000 meters. He didn't remove the effects of imitation and his spiritual interference domain because that would have been too obvious. His enemies might not be tricked if they were smart. He flew across their flanks, and the oscillation detector that the Sun Moon Empire's soul engineer on the leftmost side was holding had a reaction. Over here. He immediately informed his partners with his communication soul tool. A heavy black cannon instantly appeared on his shoulders, and he fired off a shot in Hui Yuhao's direction according to the location shown to him by his oscillation detector. A bolt of bluish-purple light fired out. Hui Yuhao's opponent's prediction was very accurate. If Hui Yuhao had continued flying forward, he would have very likely collided with this cannon shell. Class 6 Lightning Cannon, Fierce. The Sun Moon Empire's soul engineers who were responsible for intelligence and detection were the strongest ones. Previously, Hui Yuhao had discovered that 2 soul engineers among his 5 enemies were Class 7 soul engineers who were also soul sages, while the other 3 were Class 6 soul engineers. There was hardly anybody in the world better than Hui Yuhao at prediction. Hui Yuhao's frame suddenly halted midair as the cannon shell closed in on him, and the wings behind his back closed up before he began plunging downwards in free fall. Hui Yuhao had used this move very often, and its effectiveness was time-tested. Normal Soul Masters didn't dare to behave like him. Dropping down was easy, but stopping the free fall would create such a heavy load that their bodies couldn't take the pressure even if they had enough soul power. Boom! An intense explosion cracked open above his head, and large swathes of lightning bolts covered several hundred square meters around him. If Hui Yuhao's reaction had been a little slower, he would have immediately been struck by those lightning bolts. The other Soul Engineers had reacted by then, and they were swiftly moving to outflank him. Of course, Hui Yuhao wouldn't just defend passively. He wasn't just a Soul Master, he was also a Soul Engineer. A sphere of brilliant blue light surged from his chest as he fell. One could tell upon closer inspection that there was a necklace hanging around his neck, and the pendant was what was shining with blue light. This pendant seemed as large as a pigeon's egg. It could only be seen through his clothes, but one could still see the radiant and brilliant blue light that was apparently from a soul tool crafted with starlight sapphire as its main body. Light flashed again and again as blue light swiftly covered Hui Yuhao's entire body, including his head. It didn't take long before his entire body was covered in dark blue armor. This dark blue armor was filled with a kind of streamlined elegance, and it covered every single part of Hui Yuhao's body. The flying-type soul tool behind Hui Yuhao's back had come off because of that, and Hui Yuhao withdrew it into his storage ring. 3 pairs of dark blue wings quickly stretched out behind his back, and fired out blue light to stabilize his body. His helmet was like a dome that covered his head, and even his face was covered. There was an opening on his forehead, and there was a pale blue jewel in that opening. Yes, this was the human-shaped soul tool that Xian Ziwen had tailor-made for Hui Yuhao. The Sun Moon Empire had spent the longest time researching human-type soul tools. Back then, Hui Yuhao had stolen that giant human-type soul tool. That item ended up in Xian Ziwen's hands, and it was ultimately torn to pieces. The illustrious Virtue Hall and the Sun Moon Empire's world of soul engineers had always been going in 2 directions with their research into human-shaped soul tools. One direction was towards a giant human-shaped soul tool that was represented by the Hall Master of the illustrious Virtue Hall, Jing Hongchen. Jing Hongchen and many soul engineers believed that soul tools could only store more soul power when they had enough volume, and only then could they possess even stronger fighting strength to effect a battle. On the other hand, Xian Ziwen and several other soul engineers led a second direction. They wanted to minimize human-shaped soul tools. Xian Ziwen believed that even though giant human-shaped soul tools could have stronger and more forceful soul tools installed on them, and more milk bottles to store soul power could also be attached, that large volume would become clumsy, and a source of extreme inconvenience. The giant human-shaped soul tool would become very difficult to control, and they were more easily targeted and attacked by enemies. They would consume enormous amounts of soul power at the same time, and the pros didn't outweigh the cons. These 2 different schools couldn't do anything to convince the other side, so they immersed themselves in their respective research directions. There were more soul engineers who subscribed to the giant human-shaped soul tool, therefore this direction was the mainstream in the illustrious Virtue Hall back then. Even though Xian Ziwen didn't approve of that research direction, he had had no choice but to conduct research in the same direction. Otherwise, he wouldn't have had any chances to be involved with the newest technological findings in this area. Hui Yuhao had given the giant human-shaped soul tool to Xian Ziwen, and it was extremely important for Xian Ziwen's research in soul tools. He summarized the giant human-shaped soul tool's pros and cons, and then acted according to his own principles and combined that with the human-shaped soul tool that Hui Yuhao had crafted back then with the Tang sect's mechanical techniques, and thus created his own school. Xian Ziwen had conducted countless experiments before he finally presented this final product to Hui Yuhao. Xian Ziwen had called the human-shaped soul tool that Hui Yuhao was wearing a Class 7 soul tool. Even though it was Class 7, Xian Ziwen was most satisfied with this creation amongst his many others. This product combined his own research, the illustrious Virtue Hall's research findings, and the Tang sect's mechanical techniques. Back then, when research in human-shaped soul tools reached a certain standard, the most important point that puzzled soul engineers was how to control these soul tools. From their perspective, Soul tools could never be as agile or flexible as Soul Masters, no matter how inherently flexible they were. This was one of the most important reasons why smaller human-shaped soul tools weren't recognized or approved of. Since they couldn't be flexible or agile enough, these soul tools could only rely on force to fix their problems. Therefore, giant human-shaped soul tools were recognized. However, once research in giant human-shaped soul tools reached a certain standard, the Sun Moon Empire's soul engineers discovered that controlling such an item wasn't something that a single soul master could achieve by himself. Even if those soul tools could be controlled through some complex formation arrays, the human-shaped soul tool would become extremely clumsy and bulky. Moving them around on the battlefield was difficult, and they could only be used as soul tool forts. That meant the entire motivation for creating human-shaped soul would be lost. Under such circumstances, the Sun Moon Empire's soul engineers thought of something to resolve this, to control large amounts of complex formation arrays so that giant human-shaped soul tools could become agile. They could only rely on an individual's thoughts and consciousness to control those soul tools rather than one's hands using all kinds of remotes. This video will end here.